Hello, hello, hello. How is everyone today?
Good, Josh.
Cool, cool. Well, it looks like there is an aggressive amount of sunlight coming through. So let me see if I can adjust this so I'm not like in the dark here. Let's see if my fill light is enough. Does not appear to be enough. So let me restrict the sunlight perhaps a little bit. Granted, the sun will set partway through and then the lighting will be all off the other way. So this is just sure to be a day of fun. Okay, well, that's good enough. Welcome, welcome to what is actually our final class today. You've made it through 9 of these or 8 of these, and you're about to make it through the 9th. So that's an accomplishment in and of itself. So yay. I don't mean that because of the JavaScript, which I know is challenging too, but I just meant spending that much time with me is usually more than people can take. So I appreciate you just powering through. So today in our last class, we're just going to talk about a couple of things. So we're going to spend a few minutes on Angular. We're going to spend a few minutes on Vue, and then we're going to spend the last few minutes on other topics. Anything else you guys want to cover? And there's some things that you guys asked in Slack, and so we'll cover those. And if there's anything else that anybody wants to cover, data flow libraries and suggestions for that kind of thing, then fantastic. Otherwise, I'll just ramble for a little bit on relevant topics. So, okay, so we talked about Angular, we talked about React last time, and I started out by setting its difference, right, to something like Angular. And the real difference, or the biggest difference right from the outset, the most obvious thing that you're going to notice between something like React, something like Angular, is that React was a Vue library. It was just the views. And so we talked about all the things that React does not come with, right? We spent I had a whole slide last time on it. It doesn't come with a router. It doesn't come with an HTTP library. It doesn't come with. Angular does. Angular is the exact opposite of that. It's all the way on the other side of the spectrum. Angular comes with everything. And that applies to Angular 1 or Angular 2, though Angular 2 is a little bit better about breaking those libraries up a little bit so you don't have to include them all if you don't want to. Whereas with Angular 1, only a few pieces of it were actually broken out that much. So Angular is a framework, and that means 2 things. So the positive way of phrasing that would be to say that Angular comes with everything you need to build a front-end web app, and that's true. The flip side of that, or maybe the less positive way to say that, is that Angular is very opinionated, right? Angular expects you to do things a certain way, and it's going to get upset if you don't do it that way. In fact, it's not even going to work if you don't do it that way, which is a topic we'll return to later. So if you're doing Angular thin, you have to think in Angular. In fact, one of the most, I was going to say one of my most popular answers on Stack Overflow, but it's actually one of the most popular answers on Stack Overflow, just generally, is an answer that I wrote to a question of how do I think in Angular if I come from a jQuery background, right? And that, to my surprise, got really, really, really popular. It was linked for a while in the Angular 1 documentation, the official documentation there, and I think it's in the top 10 highest rated answers on Stack Overflow, which I totally don't deserve. So I stumbled into that, and it's not good for my ego, which is already dangerously bursting. Anyway, so and the reason in hindsight that it was so popular was I wrote it when there wasn't a lot of Angular documentation yet. There was the official documentation, but there really wasn't all that much yet, because it was years ago. And the second reason was that Angular was a paradigm shift. It required us thinking really differently. And I learned the hard way how to think differently in Angular. And so when this question was asked, it's like, well, here's my hard-earned thoughts on how to do that. But the point is you have to think in Angular. There's an Angular way of thinking. And if you try to do a web app in a way that doesn't align with Angular's way of thinking, in the short term, your app's going to be really borked. It's going to be messy and gross and hard to maintain. And in the long run, it probably just isn't going to work. It's going to lead to lots of bugs, performance-related bugs, like functionality-related bugs, regressions, and hard to unit test. It's going to be all kinds of things because you didn't do the things the way Angular wanted to. And that's because Angular is extremely opinionated. That's why I said it's two sides of the same coin, to be cliche. You can't have all of this stuff and say, I'm going to give you all of these things all together, all at once, if you don't box that in with some rules. If you don't say, here's how I think the user's going to end up using it. In addition, the way Angular actually works behind the scenes with this thing that they call the digest cycle, which you may have heard something about if you spent any time exploring Angular 1. With the way that it works behind the scenes, with how it processes the DOM, with how it processes the HTML and templates, with all of that, you have to do things a certain way. And we're going to see that when we do our code. It's not wrong, it's not bad, it's just you have to be aware of it, right? And so from the perspective of something like React or Vue, you're going to see that in a little bit different way. So it's not going to be as opinionated. It's going to let you have a little bit more flexibility in how you approach things. But the negative way of phrasing that is that you have to do it all yourself. You have to find an HTTP library or just use fetch or fetch polyfill like we did in our application. You're gonna have to find your own router, which both of them have their recommended systems for routing, but you're under no obligation at all to use them. You have to find your own way of doing data flow and everything else. You have to do it all yourself. So that freedom, right, comes at a cost. And that's why a lot of times we say that when you pick something like Angular and you're really restricted, or when you pick a design framework like Material, right, like Material Design, right, that spec can be really confining. But we often say that in that act of being confined, there's a lot of freedom in it. Because by being boxed in, by not being able to do anything any other way, that gives you a lot of freedom to explore other things. That whole thing is kind of done for you. So it gives you freedom to think about everything else. So that's the truth. That's my fair representation of the Vue library, like React and like Vue, which we'll see in a little while, and like Angular, which is the full framework, right? So just know that there's that difference in there. The other consequence, of course, is that Angular has a much bigger learning curve because it's more. There's just more stuff, right? It's not like in the long run, Angular has a higher learning curve. It doesn't. It's in the short term that Angular has a higher learning curve. Whereas in the short term, React has a very small learning curve, like really, really small. We basically covered like 60% of React last time. There's really just not that much more to it. There's some like gotchas and hey there's and so forth, but fundamentally we covered the big ideas in React because it's just that one piece. So in the long run, you're going to learn a lot of other stuff, but you can get started with React without knowing it, whereas you have a much higher learning curve right away with Angular because it comes with all this stuff and expects you to use it a certain way, but in the long run, it kind of evens out. So just know going in that you're going to have to make that choice. Now, because I want to talk both about Angular and about Vue today, I'm actually not going to live code. I'm just going to show you the code from our to-do app that I've already ported to Angular and Vue. That's how I got to this compromise of having time to talk about both of them. Okay. So that having been said, without further ado, we will go ahead and dive in to the Angular side of this. And so in order to do that, I'm going to share my screen, but it's going to be my web browser. Or actually, you know what? Yeah, I'm going to do it in the web browser. Okay, so here we are, right? All inside of our GitHub interface here, which I will enlarge, I will embiggen it ever so slightly. All right. Otherwise, this is the same. So this is what we wrote 2 classes ago. As of day 7, we branched off one way to day 8, which was React, and we branched off another way for day 9, which is Angular, and we branched off another one from day 7 for day 9 Vue, right? So we have 3 branches all coming from day 7. And I only mention that because they've been completely sequential until now. Day 1, day 2, day 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. But then once we hit day 7, we branched off 3 ways: Angular, Vue, and React. Okay, and we covered React last time. So 9 does not build off of 8. 9 builds off of 7 because we don't want to delete all of the React code in order to do Angular, right? We just want to start from the same place and do it either in Angular or in React. Okay, so just know that going in. So this is what we wrote 2 classes ago, where we used Webpack, we pulled everything together, and now we've added Angular. Right? So we'll start with just our package.json. Okay, and inside of our package.json, we'll see there's very, very little that's changed here. We've added Angular because duh, but we've added Angular so that we can make use of that, and that's it. That is the difference in our package.json. So npm install -- save Angular, done. Right? So now we got Angular installed. Our Webpack configuration gets to stay the same. Our server gets to stay the same. All right, so let's dive into, we're going to go both into our static folder where we have our HTML, into our source folder where we have our index.js. So the only 2 files that changed, aside from that package.json, are our index.html and our index.js inside of our source folder. So here's the first a really important thing you need to know about how Angular works is that in Angular, the view is like the official source of record. The view will kind of tell you what is supposed to happen. So when we did this in just plain JavaScript, we had to say, okay, well, when a form is submitted, I want to create a new to-do. And we did that by not doing anything in the HTML. We just had this form kind of sitting there looking at the HTML. You really don't know what's going to happen when you submit that form, because the form is just a form. But in JavaScript, we said, all right, let me grab a hold of that element, and then I'm going to listen for an event, and then I'm going to control it through JavaScript to create a new to-do, which contacts the server and creates updates of store and renders our UI. Right? So we had all of that defined in JavaScript. So looking at the HTML, it's not clear what was supposed to happen. Angular doesn't work that way. Inside of Angular, we specify using what they call directives, the things that we're expecting to happen. So right here, we have form, ng submit. So all of the built-in Angular directives start with ng as in Angular. So ng submit, this says what should happen when the thing that this directive sits on, in this case our form, is submitted, has a submit event attached to it. So we want to run a function called add to do. And so these things that look like JavaScript, control.add_to_do, right? That looks kind of like JavaScript. It's a JavaScript-like syntax that are called Angular expressions. For the purposes of today, it's equivalent to JavaScript. There are technical differences between them that you can look in the documentation to see. But for all of our purposes today, just consider it JavaScript, and that'll be enough to carry you through. And in the vast majority of circumstances, it's more than enough to carry you through. All right, so we said, okay, well, if our HTML is our official view, we need to somehow wire it into our JavaScript land. And we do that with the ng app directive. We say, okay, there's going to be something that I'm going to tell Angular about on the JavaScript side called to-do app. And we're going to put all of our JavaScript related code, we're going to connect it to the view all through this module called to-do app. And we're going to come back and look at that in just a minute. But there's somewhere in our JavaScript this module called to-do app, and this is how we tell Angular to use it. Right? So we got that. Then we say, all right, well, Angular is model view controller, MVC, right? You can also consider it model view model, which is sort of how the view world considers itself out of the box. But really, Angular is not going to confine you that much, whether it's MVC or MVVM or whatever is not really that big of a deal. And in this case, we're not even doing that anyway, because we have our unidirectional data flow, right, that we used in regular plain old JavaScript, that we used in React. We're also using Angular. We're also going to use it in Vue. But because out of the box, most people consider MVC, your view models or your controllers are connected to the UI through this thing called ng controller. That's just the way that it is. So we have this controller somewhere called to-do controller, and because we're inside of our ng app here called to-do app, our to-do app has some controller called to-do controller. And because to-do controller is kind of long, and we don't want to have to type that everywhere, we're going to access its methods with controllers. We'll say to-do controller, but as CTRL, because that's easier to type. 4 characters is way better than 14, right? So we're going to use these 3 characters. Or these 4 characters, right? So that's it. So somewhere there's a thing called to-do controller, and we're gonna reference this CTRL. So that's where we can do, okay, on submit, call CTRL's add to do function, right? CTRL.add to do, call the add to do function. We'll of course look at that in a minute. And then we have other things like, okay, well we have this input element here. And we're gonna need, because when we do this add to do, when we create a new to do, the first thing we did, both on the React side and on the plain old JavaScript side, and here in Angular and in Vue, we have to say, well, what is the value in that input element? Because we wanna get the value that whoever typed it in there, we wanna get that typed in value and use that to create a new to do. So we need a way of connecting our Vue code to our JavaScript code. In plain old JavaScript, we did that by just grabbing a handle to it, right? Document.find element by ID, right? And doing it that way. In the React world, we had access to it already, just because our Vue is in our JavaScript, right? So we already had it there. In Angular, we connected a different way. In Angular, you're never going to do something like jQuery where you do, let me find an element on a page by a CSS selector, or let me find an element on a page by its ID, or whatever. You're never going to do that in Angular. If you're doing that in Angular, I can almost guarantee you're doing something wrong. You're going, again, Angular's opinionated. You're doing something that's not expecting you to do, and it will eventually cause problems. So instead, how do you do that? Well, we do this thing in Angular 1 called two-way data binding. And that's done through something like ng-model. So we're saying that on our to-do controller, there's a property called new to-do text. And by setting that as our ng-model, that means that whenever somebody types into this input box, that value that in that control.new-to-do text, that JavaScript variable, that property on the controller object, right? That is being synchronized with whatever was typed in the input box. So as you type into the input box, it's immediately changing in that JavaScript variable. Right? It was almost as if we put a listener for keystrokes, and every time there was a keystroke, we updated the JavaScript variable to include those additional keystrokes, right? Something like that. But I said it was two-way data binding, which means that if we ever change that JavaScript variable, it's going to change what's in the input box. So whether we change it from JavaScript or the user changes it in the DOM, though that is always going to be in sync. Control.new-to-do text is always going to be exactly what's in that input element, regardless of where it gets changed. So now we have this variable called new-to-do text that we can access later on. Okay, then we have an ng-click. You can guess what that does, right? ng-click. So when we click on this button, we're going to call a function on the controller called toggle filter. And that's going to do what you think it will. It will toggle the filter. Right? Just like we did in React. Now we have this unordered list of to-do items, right? So we have an unordered list, and we have each of these list items, and inside these list items, we say, all right, I want to do an ng repeat, right? That's a directive to take the element that it's defined on, the li, and repeat it for each, right? So for each control.state.todos, right? So for each item in this to-dos array, which is exactly the same to-dos array we've been using in the previous two, right? That exact same to-dos array. For each one, we're going to create a new li, and we're going to give it a local variable called to-do, right? So you can read this like for each to-do in the to-dos list, right? For each to-do, we're going to draw out one of these li's. And when that li gets clicked, we're going to call toggle complete. And toggle complete takes in a to-do as an argument so that we can use that later on. And for each to-do in the list, we want to set the class of this based on a condition. So we're giving this what looks like a JavaScript object, right? And we're going to set the to-do complete class when this condition is true. When to-do.isComplete returns true. If it returns true, that means that complete property is set correctly, right? It's set to true, and so we want to add the to-do complete class here. And if it's not, if it returns false, the to-do is not complete, and we don't want to give it that class because we don't want to strike it through as complete because it ain't, right? Now between the li, right, inside the li, we want to set its text contents to the value of this expression. So what we've been using up above, control.toggleComplete to-do, the control.toggleFilter to-do and control state to-dos, these are expressions. And we can do we can arbitrarily evaluate an expression and print its contents out inside the HTML simply by doing double curly braces. And that's a pretty common convention in templating languages to use the double curly braces. It's also what you'll use in Vue if you end up using Vue. So we're saying that I want, in the place of these double curly braces, to print out whatever the title of the to-do is, which we get by calling to-do.getTitle, right? So for our first to-do in the list, if we weren't, and looked at this guy here, I apologize, there's other data in there. Let me force it to overwrite. And this is actually the Vue version I think we're looking at here, but come on, recompile. Anyway, if we look at the first to-do in the list, right? This first to-do here, this is how it's going to look, right? So our first to-do, where it's going to get an LI, as we're repeating for each to-do in the list, right? So we're getting one LI, first to-do, second to-do, third to-do. Our first to-do, right, if we clicked on it, would toggle the completion flag on that, right? So when we click on it, it's going to call that JavaScript code. It's also going to have a class based on whether or not it's complete. So it's going to call to-do.isComplete for first to-do. First to-do is going to return false, so it's not going to get this class. The second to-do returns complete as true, right? So to-do.isComplete returns true, so it gets the to-do double-complete class, which does the same thing it's done for the past few classes, right? So we got that in there. So that's how that works. And that's it, right? So we have these directives inside here. A way to think about, a way to conceptualize what Angular is trying to do here, the rationale for this is they're saying that if you were to design HTML as for today, right, not for 25 years ago when it was created, but if we were to create HTML from scratch today, it would probably do stuff like this. It would probably let us augment it with our own functionality, with things like being able to repeat on things, being able to click on things, being able to add and remove classes and styles and model input elements and so forth, right? We'd be able to do all that stuff that didn't make any sense and that literally did not exist 25 years ago. But if we were to define it today, we'd probably have to account for it. So this is making HTML as if it were designed today, right? That's their thinking, that's their rationale behind a lot of this. Okay? So a lot of templating languages will use similar things to this. Vue uses a very similar style to this, which we'll see in a few minutes. And other templating languages will use the double curly braces to evaluate an expression and print its contents out. So there is a learning curve here, because in addition to learning the Angular JavaScript, and learning how all that works, you also have to learn all of these directives. All right, you have to learn how this works, and you can create your own directives to do your own things and your own functionality and so forth. So there's a learning curve there. So Angular has a sizable learning curve, as I've mentioned before, just by virtue of doing that. And some of that is the learning curve that you will not, that is not transferable. So I said, like, Angular front loads its learning curve, whereas React tapers it over time, right? So you like React kind of small, learn it in an afternoon, you kind of get productive on it, but then you're gonna have to learn maybe React Router, and you have to learn Redux, and you have to learn, right? Whereas Angular starts out with a massive learning curve up front. You're not gonna learn Angular in an afternoon, you're gonna learn Angular in a week, right? And then you're just gonna kind of coast with that, and the learning curve goes down. This directive part of it, learning directives in Angular, is something that you don't ever have to make up for in something like React, because React does it in just JavaScript, and because JSX is so similar to HTML that its learning curve is much smaller. So this is a place where Angular just has a bigger learning curve. Now again, that's not to say that it's better. I personally very much like React, as you know, but that is not better. This is just different. Okay, so this is, again, like, I can look at this HTML and I know kind of what's going to happen. Like, I don't have to intuit it. This is going to say, well, is it going to have this class or not? Well, that's how I know if it's going to have this class or not. I also know how many of them are going to be simply based on this. You get some of that with React too, but only after processing the JavaScript. So there's that. From Slack, it seems like this would very quickly be difficult to read. Well, like we could in React and like you could in Vue, which we didn't explore and won't explore and aren't exploring, if you were to do this in the real world, you might have this in separate files. So you would maybe split up your to-dos into a to-do directive that did all this stuff. So you can componentize everything in Angular, not quite as easily as you can in React. Angular 2 makes that a bit easier. But you can componentize all this stuff, and in the real world, you probably would. So it's gonna be easier to read than it would seem like, because you shouldn't really have some monolithic templates. Though I've seen them in the real world. I've seen templates that are 800, 900, 1,000 lines long, and at that point, I really just go, you know, I will refrain from dropping an F-bomb there, but you know, are you freaking kidding me? It's kind of what you have to say at that point. It's like when in the real world, I'll see these like Angular controllers or random JavaScript code that's 800, 900, 1,000 lines long, and that's ridiculous. If your functions got that long, you're doing something wrong. They should just never be that long. Can you imagine how you'd write a unit test for something like that? You can't do it. And so, like, if you end up doing it, like, you're doing something wrong. If you end up doing that path, you're doing something wrong. So you can componentize all of this. But your point, Matthew, is well taken. That this is, in my opinion, not as easy to read as React, right? And again, I was a huge fan of Angular. It was a paradigm shift. Part of my, or a sizable chunk of my reputation in the engineering community came from Angular 1, right? So I mean, I have a special place for Angular in my heart, right? I do. But I think React is better. It's more modern. Angular 2 learned a lot from Angular 1. Angular 2 is way better than Angular 1, right? And so Angular 2 still has all these directives, and we'll look at an example of how it's different in a minute. Not a full example, just a kind of a limited subset. But it's still the same core principles, right? It's still going to be these directives that you either like or you don't like, that you're either willing to learn and that speak to you because of that, or they don't. They don't speak to me anymore. I think that there's a better way to do it in 2017 that there wasn't in 2010. And so that's how I think about it. That was a long and rambling response to a non-question, but there we go. So that's enough about the HTML. Let's dive into the JavaScript, right? So remember, this is driven by, at some point, we know that there's going to be some, and we told Angular that we have some module called to-do app, right? So in JavaScript, we have to declare that somewhere. We also know that as part of that to-do app module, we have a controller called to-do controller, right? And that to-do controller has an add to-do function, it has a new to-do text variable, has a toggle filter function, has a toggle complete function, and somewhere it has a state object with a to-dos property, right? So we know from the view code here that we need that stuff. So let's take a look at it. So here we are in index.js. So this, we start sort of similar. I imported Angular here, right? Because we're going to use it, but we import our to-do app. We formerly had this render the UI function, which I just have commented out because Angular has its own lifecycle. You can't manage it yourself. And that is, for better or worse, you can't do it. If you try, you're going to end up in this place where you have to manually insert yourself into Angular's digest cycle and this is where you've seen maybe references to like scope.apply and those kinds of things to try to get Angular to cooperate with you. Really, that's the wrong way to do it. Again, Angular's opinionated. Do it the way Angular wants, which is how we did it here. So we have this same unidirectional data flow, but we're doing it a bit differently than we otherwise would. Okay, so we're going to create a to-do controller, and this is just a plain JavaScript class. You don't have to do this using classes, but that's what you'll see most of the time. So that's how I chose to do it here. So it's a class, and in our class constructor function, right? In our class constructor function, it takes an app as an argument, which we assign here. So what is this app? Well, this app is an instance of our to-do app that we imported up here, right? Our to-do app that we use to get to do, app.get to-dos and app.set to-dos and all that stuff comes from this thing. So we'll see where that comes from here. But to create a new to-do controller, we know it's going to take a copy of to-do app. Okay? And we just store it so we can access it later. And in this case, we sort of subscribe to those changes. So we're doing app.subscribe, just kind of like what we did before, right? So anytime the state of it changes, we can call our own render the UI function. And our own render the UI function just takes in some to-dos and overwrites the state with those to-dos, right? So back on our view, remember we had, where there we go, control.state.todos, right? So controller is this and this, so this.state.todos, right? So there's our to-dos controller. So every time our to-do app instance gets new to-dos or makes a change of any kind, then we call this function, we call this.render the UI, we pass those to-dos in, and then we overwrite this.state with those to-dos. So that's what's happening here. And then we define those functions that we needed. And these are pretty simple. These are very, very similar to what we already done twice now. So when we want to add a to-do, we're going to call app.todo, or app.addToDo, which is, again, our to-do app, .addToDo, and we pass in this.new to-do text. Because, again, we bound it right here, control.new to-do text. So that will have, this.new to-do text will have whatever was in that input box. And then again, we just clear it out because it's two-way data binding. We can just overwrite it with an empty string and it'll clear it out. So this will behave exactly like our React version and exactly like our pre-React version, our plain JavaScript version. Toggle filter just calls app.toggleFilter. Again, the data flow happens otherwhere, right? It happens inside of to-do app because we have the unidirectional data flow. All we need to do is to tell app what we're thinking. We're thinking that we want to toggle the filter, and we let it worry about what that actually means. UI is a function of state, even in this Angular app. Toggle complete, same thing. We just say, hey, there's a to-do here, kind of want to toggle its completion status. You worry about what that means and let me know if I need to update myself, right? So all of that. And here is our Angular code. And this is the only place in this file where there's any Angular specific code. We tell Angular we want to create a new module, and we're calling it to-do app. Now, Angular has this module and dependency injection and dependency management system. So you can specify that this module depends on other modules. We are only having one here, but that's what this empty array is. You could specify other modules that it depends on. And those would be modules that you maybe imported up here. So if you installed them with NPM or something like that, like if you use Angular material, right? So if we go to material.angularjs.org, which is the Angular material design library. So if you wanted to, make use of things like the, I don't know, something like the nav bar, that exists here, right? You want to make use of these kinds of material components. Then this comes as an Angular module. So you do npm install Angular material, right? And then you'd probably import it at the top of the file. And then that's called ng material. So inside of this array, you'd say ng material. And that would tell Angular that you're depending on that module. And so somewhere in Angular's code, or in Angular materials code, they had angular.module ng material. And that's where they defined all their stuff. And so because they called angular.module ng material and then defined all their stuff, it's all in that module. And just by importing it, which means that it got called, right? Angular.module, ng material got called somewhere else, right? In their code, inside our node modules folder, that we can just include it right here inside this array and get access to those features. Okay? And that is for this thing called dependency injection, or what you may, if you come from a Java background, know as inversion of control. So remember back up here, we said that our to-do controller is just, it needs to take an instance of to-do app as an argument. Right? We know it needs to get that in there. Where does that come from? Nowhere in our app do we say new to-do controller. This to-do controller gets instantiated just because of this line. That's it. Just because of this line, it gets instantiated. But what it's going to do, what Angular is going to do, is it's going to look at the constructor, and it's going to say the constructor is looking for something called app. Do I have something called app, right? Well, we've defined a service called app, and we passed in our to-do app factory function, okay? So I've told Angular that if anybody asks you for something called app in this to-do app module, then give it one of these. And I put a note here that these are singletons, which means that if 10 things all ask for an app, they're all gonna get the same app. It's only gonna be instantiated one time. So we've just said that we have this service, right? Because think of model view control. This is like a service, is like a model, right? So and if you think about it, that's really what our to-do app is. It contains some logic, but it's really just models, right? So you define those with services. So we said there's a service called app, and when anybody wants one, use to-do app to do it. And so it's just going to call the to-do app function, and that to-do app function, whatever it returns, which in our case is an instance of to-do app, it's going to get assigned to app and passed in. So we said, here's our controller. We're going to call it to do controller, and here's the class that we're using or the function that we're using. And so again, when we ask for it, in here we say, all right, for this section of code, for everything inside the body, use the to-do controller. So it's going to say, do I have one already? No, I don't. So I'm going to go create one. All right, well, to create one, I'm going to call it a constructor function, but oh, that needs something called app. Do I have something called app? Nope. Do I have it defined anywhere? Yes, to-do app has a service called app, and it takes this. So let me create one just by calling the to-do app function. And whatever it returns, I'm going to store an app, and that's what I'm going to pass to the constructor function. And then I'm going to create a new to-do controller, and then we're good because then I can put it right here and get access to it inside the view. So dependency injection. Okay, I told you Angular has a higher learning curve up front. All right, so, but we're not done here. So remember I said that Angular's opinion, you have to do things Angular's way or else, right? Well, so we sort of have a problem because our app is asynchronous, right? And so we are going to the server to get information, and then when data comes back, we're updating everything, right? There's no function in Angular that's like React DOM.render. Right? That's what we did last time just to re-render app. We said React DOM.render, and that renders out our application. So anytime we need to update the view, we just call React DOM.render, and it updates the view, and it's that simple. Angular doesn't have that. Angular manages that cycle for us. So we can't do that anywhere, right? So we said we're going to subscribe to these changes. So our fetch call, it goes to the server, right? And gets data. When it's done, it's going to update the state. Since it updates the state, we have to notify Mixin. It's going to call this function, which is going to call render the UI, and this.state is going to equal to-dos. But it will not update the view. We changed it in the instance of to-do controller, but Angular is managing that cycle, and Angular doesn't know that it needs to refresh. So in React, we said, when we got all this new data and we know we need to refresh, like when we called our version of render the UI, then we said, okay, React DOM, render it out again, right? And then let it, and it manages whether or not it has to re-render everything or only parts of the tree. Angular doesn't have that. Angular has its own cycle, and it manages all of that for us. So what that means is we can't use fetch. We can't use $.ajax. We can't use any asynchronous function, even promises, out of the box. So like new promise, which we used a couple of times in class to create new promises. You can't use that with Angular. You absolutely cannot do it because it's outside of Angular's cycle. And you have to do everything within Angular's cycle. So Angular's opinionated, and it comes with something for us. So remember we said that we just are telling Angular that there's a service, it's called app, and it's going to be our to-do app. So we actually modified our to-do app to take advantage of that. So our factory function now takes in this argument called $HTTP. $HTTP is one of the built-in Angular services that is for HTTP communications, their version of something like fetch. Okay, so it does return promises. Angular promises anyway. And there's if you needed to create a new promise in Angular, you have to use a service called $Q. You can't use new promise, it won't work. So, I mean, the JavaScript will work, but the view will just never update. So we take in $HTTP. So anytime we used fetch here, we replaced it with $HTTP. So let's look at an example of that. So we want to add a new to-do, we call $HTTP.post, which does a post, right? And we do it to the same endpoint we did, but this function signature just allows us to pass in the object that we want to appear as a body. So this is equivalent to us before doing, body JSON.stringify, object with title. This is just kind of doing that for us. The Angular library is a little bit more streamlined in that case. Okay, and it does return a promise, so we can call .then, and this returns the whole thing, and Angular automatically parse the body, so we don't have to do response.json. We just need to pull the data, what they call data, which is the response body, off of it, and then now we have these two lines are identical to what they were before. So we just had to change these two from what they were in fetch. Same thing with removing a to-do, $HTTP.delete. So we call .delete on this particular, to this particular URI, and then, and this part is identical, right? Toggle complete, .put, same thing. Second argument, just like .post, was this. And then we pull the JSON parsed body that's now a JavaScript object off the .data, and then the other lines are all the same. Okay. All right, and so then lastly, right when we create a new instance of to-do app, we know we need to get the to-dos that are on the server, right? We know we need to start with the list of to-dos that the server already has that were saved last time, right? So just like before, instead of doing fetch, we do $http.get to /todos, again, grab the data object, and then these two are identical. And because we did this inside of Angular's timeline, this app.setTodos is synchronous. Because again, remember in our unidirectional data flow, all of it has to be synchronous along the way. Once you set it, it has to be synchronous. So Angular is tracking this, right? Because it's in an Angular's it's one of Angular's promises, one of Angular's services. Angular is tracking how this is going to work. So when we call then we call app.setTodos. App.setTodos calls this .set state with the to-dos, right? This .set state calls the function from our state mixin. So now we have the state actually set correctly. Then we call this .notify synchronously. This .notify calls our functions correctly. This which is what we passed here, right, to app.subscribe. So that immediately calls this function, which immediately sets this state to this. Now, because we're in Angular's lifecycle, because of that then that came from the $HTTP, because we're in Angular's lifecycle, that even though this changed, ran the exact same block of code, but because it happened inside Angular's lifecycle, the view will update accordingly. Okay, so this is what I mean when I say you have to think in Angular. You have to do things Angular's way, because if you don't, sometimes the app will just literally not work. So if you did not change to-do app, and you did all of this code that's in index.js here exactly right, it wouldn't work. And you put console logs everywhere, and you'd see it's calling the function, it's setting it. I can see this.state.todos equals my array of to-dos, but the view isn't updating. All my console logs are right. Why is this not working? And it's not working because Angular has its own cycle, and you did something outside of Angular. So anytime you do anything asynchronously, meaning not function called function called function called function, but something asynchronous would include a server call, right? Because it's going to come back with a response later. Something like an event, listening to a button click, listening for a form submission, stuff like that. Asynchronous. Anytime you do something asynchronously, promises, callbacks, observables, anything asynchronously, it's outside of Angular's lifecycle, and so you have to use the Angular equivalent or wrap it yourself. So that's just the way this works. Okay, so that's Angular. Now let's take a look at Vue. Vue is much more like React, and this is the day 9 Vue branch as opposed to the day 9 branch, which is just Angular. Sorry about that, but they were already labeled that way. So day 9 Vue is our Vue version of this, and there are 2 parts that change just like before. Okay, so our package.json, we have installed Vue. That was really the only change we made here, is that we made sure we had a version of Vue, npm install -- save Vue. So we got Vue. Okay, our webpack stayed the same and everything else, so we're good there, right? So we're gonna look at the same couple of files, starting with index.html. Now, this is going to look, at first, an awful lot like Angular, okay? So we have a form, and we said Vue, which they prefix with V, they have these things that look like Angular directives, and it's really just their template syntax. V on, meaning on, submit, and I want you to prevent default before you do it, right? Because we were doing that on our form submission, then call add to do. Right, and then we have this V model, same thing as before. It does 2-way data binding, just like Angular did. We have our filter button V on click, toggle filter. And we have V4, much like in Angular ng repeat, right? To do in to-dos. V bind class, exact same thing you saw in Angular. V on click, same thing, right? So this looks an awful lot like Angular. And there is a key difference, though, is that one difference, there's 2 key differences. One is that this is just a Vue library. Angular is a full framework. This is just a Vue library. That's one difference. But that's not the most important difference in looking at this. The most important difference in looking at this is that this operates much more like React than Angular 1 does. So this is the way I think about Vue. I think about Vue as jQuery mixed with Angular, mixed with React. That's how there are components of all of those inside of it. What do I mean by that? Well, there's no ng app equivalent here. There's no ng controller equivalent here. So how did it know to process these parts? Because at some point we told it, I want you to run against that node. That's how we would do with jQuery, right? Where jQuery we do $ and then hash app and then do whatever we wanted to on there. So it's kind of got that piece to it. So if you were doing something in Angular or React, you're writing an app from the ground up. But with jQuery, you could just like augment a page. You could just go in and say, I want this one node to do something on click or whatever, right? You could just do one thing on the page with jQuery. That was where jQuery's sweet spot was. Vue allows you to do that. So you can just say, I want to do this random code, this random node on my page. I want to do something with Vue with it. And maybe this other random node on the page, and maybe I want to do something else. But you don't have to do a full app. You could, but you don't have to. So in that sense, it's kind of jQuery-like. It's Angular-like in the sense that the Vue is the record to a high degree. This is telling us what's going to happen here. So you have these things that are like Angular directives. Not as powerful as Angular directives because it's really just a templating language, but it's like Angular directives. V on click, right? So on click, run this function. So we have that part and in that sense, very much like Angular. But it's like React in that you can define components. So you can say, this is one like defined cohesive component that I want to render at a certain point in the page. So it's got pieces of all three inside of it. So now that we looked at the Vue, which was kind of similar to Angular, let's look at our index.js. We did not change to do app in this case. The to do app is exactly as it was pre-React and exactly as it was in React. So the only thing we changed here is our index.html and our index.js. Okay, so we import Vue, and I'm importing the ES6 version of it here, but you could import other ones. The reason that I've imported this particular one is because I'm using these inline, V on click. It's in my HTML, in the browser, so it needs to process it. For performance reasons, Vue has a virtual DOM like React does, right, where it can get intelligent about what it has to update on the page. In order to do that, it uses templates that are compiled. So normally in like a real build process, you would compile your templates and they would never be in the browser. It would be pure JavaScript. Remember like JSX compiles down to pure JavaScript? These HTML templates in Vue will also compile down to pure JavaScript. But in order to get this to work out of the box, so that just inside the browser, right? So if we like right click and view source here, right? We see the view tags, right? The little templating syntax here. In order to get that to work, you can't use the main library. We have to import the standard full library here. So that's why I had to do that. But you don't worry about that for now. Just that's the reason that it looks a little funky here. Okay, so then we're gonna do something similar. And again, just like with React, this onReady stuff is actually not totally necessary because again, any framework's gonna do that for you, but we have it here because it's not gonna hurt. The render the UI and subscribe, kind of similar, but here's what we do. OnReady, we create a new instance of to-do app, exactly like we did in pure JavaScript, exactly like we did in React, and we create a new Vue component right in line called Vue app. And we're saying I wanna attach it to this particular element, right? That's the element with the ID of app, right? I want to attach it to that element. I want to give it this data. So to start with, new to-do text, which is the value of this input element, right? It's going to start empty. I could start it with something else if I wanted to, but it's going to start empty. And in this sense, it's very React-like. I'm going to give it these to-dos, which I'm going to start with app.getToDos. That's what it's going to start with. And I'm going to define some methods that I can access, things like toggle complete, toggle filter, and add to do. And the code inside here is the same that you saw in Angular, it's the same that you saw in React, it's the same as you saw in pure JavaScript. But we're defining these methods. And just by putting a toggle complete method inside the methods object in our Vue object here, we can do things like v on click toggle filter, right? V on click toggle complete, and so forth. All right. So just by creating this new thing, it is going to attach it already. And then it's going with this starter data and with these methods. But we also need to subscribe for changes, right? So when the server comes back with new data, we need to subscribe to changes. So the way we go about subscribing to changes is the same as before. We listen for it, render the UI with a new set of to-dos. So we do that. And then we just say view app, and that's the instance that we created here, dot to-dos. So our data becomes object properties that we can just access. View app dot to-dos equals to-dos. And behind the scenes, Vue has a watcher, so that anytime this changes, asynchronously or not, anytime that object changes, the to-dos property of data, right? Anytime that to-dos property changes, it's going to recalculate the view and update it if it has to. So in that sense, it's both like React and like Angular. So it's like a weird bastard child of all three frameworks. But and I say that in the most loving of ways. Okay, that's basically all I really want to talk about with Vue. Okay, and so here's my advice to you. Okay, so my advice to you is go with whatever framework or library speaks to you, whichever one you're going to be most productive in. From an objective perspective, there are tons and tons and tons of React and Angular 1 jobs. React is growing, Angular 1 is not. Angular 1 isn't growing because of Angular 2. Angular 1 is growing, but not nearly as rapidly as React. Vue is getting more popular, but Vue is still really minor. I wouldn't plan on making a career out of Vue in 2017. Maybe in 2018 if it continues its growth, but it's not there yet. Vue is interesting, but it's not backed by a major company. Angular is backed by Google, React is backed by Facebook. So in that sense, Vue is maintained by a very small core team. They've been really responsive to changes, but who knows whether that'll continue going forward. So Vue is cool, it's got a lot going for it, but really small team, no major corporate baggage. It's not used super broadly yet, so there's not a lot of documentation. What documentation they have is decent, but you're not going to find as much as you are with Angular 1 and React, which have both been around for a while and both have massive, massive user bases in addition to really big corporate sponsors. So that's what I'll say on those three frameworks. Now, a question from Slack from last week actually was on like the data flow in all of this and how you're sort of boxed in. And I kind of answered that a little bit with React and with Angular already. The long and short of it is you can use whatever data flow concept you want in any of these. React lends itself natively very easily to a unidirectional data flow. Angular and Vue lend themselves very easily to more of an MVVM, a model view model, or model view controller, whatever you want to call it, approach to this. In the sense that they say, you're going to have the stuff over here that maybe communicates with the backend, and you're going to have your UI code, like your HTML and your templates and all that stuff over here, and then you're going to define something in the middle, what we usually call the view model, right? Which is going to glue those two pieces together, and data is going to be moving in both directions, right? So to and from the view model and the view, and to and from the model and the view model, right? So you're going to have these two-way data flows everywhere else. That having been said, both libraries, as you saw today, can be used with the unidirectional data flow. We did it with Angular and we did it with Vue today in both of these cases. So you absolutely can. So that's not like but they're not built to do that out of the box, right? And you can use React similarly in MVC or MVVM. There's no reason why you couldn't, but it does. If that's not what it's just going to do out of the box, it's not what it's just there, like blah, it's doing it, right? No, Angular and Vue are very much like that. React is very much not. So there's that distinction there as well. But you can use whatever data flow you want. And when you use something like when you're using Angular, when you're using React, when you're using Vue, even though Angular is a big framework and lends itself to this MVC very well, I still recommend being really conscious about how you make data flow choices. Angular and Vue make it so easy to screw up. It's easy to screw up in React too, but not nearly as much. Two-way data flow, in my opinion, is hell. It's nightmarish and it shouldn't even exist. In my opinion, data should always be moving one direction in an application. It makes things so much easier to reason about. If you're in a really complex Angular app and you're pointing at a node someplace and you say, why does that show I have 17 unread messages? And you might ask yourself, where is that information coming from, right? Where is 17 coming from? If you're doing something with React, right, it's going to be, I know exactly where that came from, assuming you didn't bork it along the way. It came in via a prop. Where did it come from? Well, it came in via a prop. Where did it come from? Oh, well, that came from the store. So it's always going to be, let me trace that back in one fluid motion. Okay, because you had a unidirectional data flow and you had one official source of record someplace, like a Redux or Flux store, if you're using one of those libraries, or some homebrew solution like we did here, where we just had this one to-do app instance, right, that managed our official state. So we always know that the data is kind of moving in that direction. With Vue, it's sort of like that, but a little bit looser. So why is that just displaying that piece? Well, it's displaying that piece because that's what's on its data object. Why was that on its data object? You don't necessarily know, and you have to go and investigate. And with Angular, it's compounded even further. And so if you're not conscious, when you're creating those apps, you're not conscious to have that data moving in one direction, it's really easy to get that really, really borked. So that number 17, you don't know. You don't even know where it came from, because it could be coming from the controller and it was just stuck there. It could be coming from a service and it's just stuck there. Or it could be that there's 3 services on the same page, all accessing the same piece of information, each one of which is updating the DOM, and the DOM which is updating it, because you're two-way data binding, right? And so you don't know, only under this special confluence of events, because Jupyter happened to be passing through the right constellation, that it rendered on the page a certain way. And that's very, very real. That is a legitimate case, which is why Facebook created what they call Flux. Flux, as I mentioned last week, is it's an alternative to MVC. It's not a library. It's a way of handling data flow. And you could use Flux in Angular or Vue or React or anywhere, just like you can use MVC in any of those. It's just a way of thinking about it. They did that to say that data should move in one direction, because they actually had that very problem, where in the early days of Facebook, the Facebook Messenger, before it was its own app and was all in one, that the unread message count was often wrong. And it got wrong because of this, and it was a bug that kept regressing. They'd fix it and write a unit test, and it would come back and rear its ugly head later, because they'd have all this data crossing. And things got way worse for them when they went to have like their advertising portal, and they started adding in where you had this whole, I don't know if you've ever created Facebook ads before, but if you create a Facebook ad, when you go to do that, like there's this whole list of items that have to be tracked along the way, right? Like, so you set maybe geography, and you set this other parameter, you set 15 parameters along the way, and all the while it's tracking number changes along the way. With that being two-directional data flow, they found that extremely challenging. So they said, let's just move all that data in one direction, which just makes sense. And then an alternative to Flux is a library called Redux. My personal opinion is, if you're using React, use Redux. Like, you don't have to, but use it, because there's documentation galore. It's got a little bit of a learning curve, but there's documentation galore. There's a billion resources out there for it, and it's just really solid. It's just really good. I've also used Redux inside of Angular. In fact, there's an Angular plugin you can get called NG Redux, which allows you to put a Redux store inside of Angular. And there are similar plugins for Angular to use, like a Flux data flow too, or you can do the same types of principles yourself. The important part is to always be cognizant of how the data is moving in your application. Whether it's React or Vue, you're picking a data flow library, and Vue has an officially recommended like Redux alternative that works well. There's no reason you couldn't use Redux, but they have one in the Vue world if you're curious about that. But again, same thing. Whereas if you're in Angular, out of the box, you're not going to think you need one, because Angular comes with everything. And so since Angular comes with everything, that puts a lot of power at your fingertips. And so just make sure you're cognizant about data flow. Because otherwise you're going to be, in troubleshooting hell for, your whole career. Okay, so there's that. You know, there are questions being typed, but while that question is being typed, I'll move on to some other questions from Slack. Oh, there it goes. Would you suggest someone pausing comfortable with ES6 before moving and getting into React? Also, I've been probably dabbling with JS for about a year. Do you think this course is enough JS to get somewhere where they need to be messing around? Okay, good question. One, I think a mistake would be to think about ES6 as something other than JavaScript. So to say, should I learn ES6 is the wrong way to think about it. ES6 is JavaScript. ES6 is also called ES 2015, and it's 2017. So it just is JavaScript. That's like saying, should I learn more about how a function works in JavaScript before I learn the right? Well, yeah, you should, because that's how it works. That's JavaScript. It has functions, right? So there's some syntactical sugar in there as well, but it's just JavaScript. I don't consider that learning anything different. It's just JavaScript out of the box. It's not like TypeScript or CoffeeScript or something where you're actually learning something completely different. If you're going to learn Angular 2, for example, you're going to have to learn TypeScript. You can do it without it, but all the documentation assumes TypeScript, and it's designed for that. It's at the Angular 2 experience, the developer experience is better with TypeScript. So in that case, learn TypeScript and then learn Angular. You can probably learn a lot of it in parallel, but there's a sizable chunk you can't that you're just going to have to know out of the box. So in that case, that applies really well. If you're doing a library that used CoffeeScript, it would be the same thing. You'd have to learn CoffeeScript before it. But ES6, ES 2015, whatever, it is JavaScript. It just is. It's what is supposed to be working in browsers. A lot of browsers support fat arrows now. A lot of browsers support promises now. A lot of browsers support let and const and so forth. So just assume it as part of JavaScript and don't think about it as something separate to learn. To actually answer your question, though, because I think it's related to the second question you asked. Yes, if you've gone through this course and most of it at least made decent sense, like I get some of it, particularly surrounding all of the prototypes, you're not going to get that right away. You're going to learn that over time in your JavaScript career, and that's totally cool. But as long as you can follow the code in some of this, you definitely know enough JavaScript to learn React or Angular or Vue. Or anything else. Angular 2, again, you have to learn some TypeScript, but that's just the way that it is. So yes, you definitely know enough now. Cool. So that having been said, some other questions. I'm scrolling through. Bear with me. I think I answered, Matthew, I think I answered your questions from the JS Q&A channel, but you might want to check and make sure that I actually have. And okay, so Pedro asked a couple of questions, so let's go to those. What are your thoughts on coding boot camps? Hit and miss. Some of them are great, some of them are not. It depends on what you want to get out of them. So the best possible advice that I can give you, and I'm saying this both as somebody who knows JavaScript pretty well, and also as somebody who regularly interviews developers. I'm not a recruiter, I don't work in HR, but I work with a lot of startups, and so I'm often a guy who I just help them interview developers sometimes. I'm certainly not an expert in any of that, so take it for what it's worth. But what I look for more than anything is that somebody's actually coded something. That's what I care about. Like if I Google somebody and they have like a reputation on Stack Overflow, they show up on GitHub and there's some recent code in there and the code is kind of clean and shows that they can do it, that's enough for me. Then I'm going to ask them some questions and make sure that they know loosely what they're talking about. But like that's enough for me. I want to know that they've actually written something before. So like that they went to a coding boot camp really doesn't mean that much to me. So that's why they're varying quality. If you're looking at coding boot camps, what I would say is, what are you going to get out of it? And some of them promise jobs at the end, and if they can deliver on that, that's fantastic if that's your goal. But if your goal is just to learn JavaScript, then I would look at it, look what people say about it, and say, is this going to teach me what I feel I need to know in order to learn stuff? But I wouldn't do it to have the name behind you, because I don't think most people are looking too closely at it. Like just by reputation, I just don't think that's the case. It's not like graduating from MIT or something where that name happens to mean something, which by the way, in most programming jobs, it doesn't anymore either. Simply because, like, again, it's the doing that matters. Okay, another question. I joined a company. done only backend, like to transition to full stack. What would you recommend to be considered? Okay, so great. So if you're, this is going to apply to anything. If you want a job in JavaScript, backend, front end, full stack, best advice by far is to show that you know what you're talking about. And there are a couple of ways to do that. One is by having a resume where you've already worked for companies and already done it. That probably doesn't apply to any of you. Otherwise, why are you taking my class? So then how else do you do that? Well, there's two ways that I would recommend to do that. One is by getting on Stack Overflow and getting a reputation. Go on there and answer questions. It's a good use of your time. And you'll learn by doing it, right? Don't just pick questions you already know the answer to. Pick ones that are going to make you Google around, try a little something out, create a JS bin or a JS fiddle or something, and then post a reply. Like, do that. You'll learn a lot along the way. Like, you're learning real stuff and at the same time demonstrating that you know shit. I actually get not so much anymore because I don't post on Stack Overflow anymore. But when I was active on Stack Overflow and for the tail after I stopped, I got calls from or emails from recruiters every week asking me, if I would be interested in talking about some position someplace, just by virtue of showing that I know what I'm talking about. Now I have a decently high reputation on Stack Overflow, but it's just by virtue of showing up in that list. They're going to look who's contributing. So if you do that, I get on there, build that reputation. And also the Stack Overflow has a career section. So you can go post your stuff on there and it's kind of connected to your Stack Overflow profile. So use that as a thing. But even more important than that is get something on GitHub. Do something. If you have the capacity, find something that you're interested in, some loose sort of problems you want to solve, and just create an app for it and put it up there. Because you've proven that you can write code. That's what they care about. They prove that you can write code and write good code. Write code that follows those principles. Write code that's clean and easy to read. Write code that has unit tests. If you do that, you're going to be impressed because anybody who's looking at it's going to see, oh, yeah, he can write code. I can see that. You know how I know? Because he fucking wrote code, right? Because it's right there. I can see it on GitHub. He wrote it. Right? So like that's the proof. The proof is in the pudding, as I guess would be the better way of saying that. And so so there it is, right? So those are the two best things I can do. Is if you want to get a job in JavaScript, prove you can do it. And the easiest ways to prove that you can do it, and there's no easy way, but the easiest ways to prove it are by answering questions, because you're demonstrating relevant domain knowledge, and by building something, anything, and you're just showing you can build it. That's going to help. And if you want to like do some freelance work on the side, try to find some interesting jobs that you can do. Go to network like crazy. And this is hard for people who work in the engineering world because it's I want to say that like there's no way to say this without sounding offensive, but most engineers are like basement dwellers. Right? And they don't want to like venture out into the real world and talk to people because it's awkward. It's like really weird and awkward. I had to work really hard I like to seem like an outgoing person, but I'm really not. And so if you work on that and like attend, go to meetups, like go to meetup.com and find a meetup or search for Facebook events around or something. Find where other developers are congregating and where people who hire developers are congregating and go spend time with those people because you're going to find work and jobs that way. See if you can help co-organize some of those things because that looks great on a resume too, or on LinkedIn or on your Stack Overflow profile or whatever, right? So just get involved in the local community. You're expanding your network and again, proving that you know things and also learning along the way. And I'm going to come back to that concept in just a minute. So I'm going to scroll back down in Slack because I think there were new questions. Okay. I noticed that you've only been doing it for a year and how did you get professional so quickly? Also, okay, really good questions, Matthew. Okay, so I have been doing React for more than a year. I have no idea when I last updated that profile. Do they change it with time or do I have to go in there and manually change it? I don't know. I really don't know, but I've been doing React for more than a year. Not that much more. It's been less than 2 years because I was really big in Angular. Like that was I was up to here in Angular for a couple of years. So like that is it. So how did I get really proficient really fast? I'll be completely honest here. One of them is, and this is such a cheap ass answer, but one of them is like React spoke to me. Like it made sense to me. It just did. Angular 1 just made sense to me. Ruby on Rails never made sense to me. I don't like it. It's weird. It's not a problem with Ruby. It's a problem with Josh. It just doesn't make sense to me. I don't like it. If Drew is listening, I apologize because I know he comes from a Ruby background. I know a couple of you probably do, but like it just doesn't speak to me. I didn't get it. And before I was in Angular, I was working in Dojo, which was I don't know if anybody remembers Dojo, but like that didn't really speak to me either. jQuery was fine for what it did, but that was kind of it. Other frameworks like Vue doesn't speak to me. It just doesn't. It doesn't speak to me. React did. It just made sense. It made sense in my head. And so that helps a lot. And that's why I say, like, find the framework that makes sense to you or that makes the most sense to you, because you're going to be most productive in it anyway. Like because I work with startups so often, they say, what framework should I use? And I say, the one your team knows. Like, that's like the honest answer. And people like think I'm being smart ass, but I'm not. I'm like you want to get to market and like your team knows A, and should you learn B? I don't know. You better have a pretty compelling reason, because otherwise you're going to take time to learn B, and you already know it. So that's a bit. So that's part of it. Is it just spoke to me, just made sense to me. I liked that it was pure JavaScript. I liked the data flow. I just liked that. And I will say, when I first looked at React, I had the same reaction that everybody does. I looked at React and I said, they're putting HTML in the JavaScript, and that's gross. And they shouldn't do that. They're doing something wrong. I don't care if they are Facebook. This is wrong. And I got over that. When I started playing around with it, I got over that. It didn't seem something dark, exactly. I didn't think that it was, I didn't think it was right. I honestly, I think it's just wrong, that there's something fundamentally wrong about it. But I realized, and this is something that Vue expresses too, and that Angular still views it a little differently, but Vue and React both say, well, we're not talking about separation of concerns. That the JavaScript and the HTML aren't different concerns. They're different layers. That's different. And so once I went out, I went, and I was like, you're right, they're not. Like they're the same thing. Like I'm saying ng submit, I'm saying ng click. They are inherently the same concern. It's just that they're different technology layers, right? And so that influenced the way that I wrote Angular. As I started thinking about them in that way. And I started organizing by feature rather than by layer. So in some like Angular boilerplates, they'll put all their filters in one directory. They'll put all their directives in another directory. And they'll put all their services in another directory. And they'll put all their templates in another directory. And all their controllers in another directory. And they're separating by layer. The better way, and the Angular team will tell you, the better way is to organize by feature. So in our to-do app, we have this thing called a to-do. In a folder, we should have a folder, someplace called to-do. And inside there, it should have its template, it should have its CSS, it should have its JavaScript. It should have everything related to that to-do in that one folder. That just makes sense. And so when we get to that level, we're saying, okay, well, it's just separating by technology. We're separating by the technology layer, but not by the feature. And so I got over that. And once I did, again, React just made sense to me. But that's not a very satisfying answer to most of you. So how do I know React so well? I teach it. Like you learn, I found I learn far best by teaching. Try an answer on Stack Overflow. See if you can do it. Trying to explain something to somebody else is something that will help you gain a stronger understanding of it. Richard Feynman, and I'm going to bastardize the paraphrase here, but Richard Feynman, the notable quantum physicist, right? He used to say, back when he was alive, he used to say that you don't understand something unless you can explain it to a 5-year-old. And he was talking about quantum physics, right? I mean, so that his point was that unless you can explain it to someone, you don't understand it. So I found that I've been able to really strengthen my understanding by trying to explain it to somebody else. Give a talk if you're comfortable with that, right? I obviously am. If you're comfortable, give a talk on it. You're gonna, by developing that talk, by working on that talk and creating a slide deck and doing all of that and some code examples, you're gonna learn a lot about it, a lot more than you otherwise would have, because you have to explain it to somebody else. And the more you do that, whether it's talks, whether it's Stack Overflow, whether it's the mailing list for something, you're just gonna learn a lot more along the way. And learn by doing, like actually do things, encounter real problems. That's how you're gonna learn something like that. So with startups, yes, that's what I do for a living. So, I mean, I teach this stuff, but really I work with products and startups. So I'm what you would call a co-founder for hire, like a startup mercenary. So I help early stage startups, ones that don't have a product yet, figure out their product vision. I help them find what we usually call product market fit, or in really early stage startups, we often call problem solution fit. Help them understand who their customers are, if their customers even exist. Help them understand what their product strategy should be and their roadmap for their product, and all of that. So I work mostly on the business side rather than on the technology side, but it's software as a service startup, so it's all closely related to this. So that's what I actually do for a living. So I give talks on that. I run meetups on that. I also organize and mentor at like startup weekends, which brings me to the thing that I said that I was going to mention a few minutes ago. So the other thing that everybody should do, everybody should go to a startup weekend. And I cannot express to you enough the value of doing it. Startup weekend, and you can go to startupweekend.org. I'll drop a link in Slack, but startupweekend.org are run by people like me who don't get paid for it. We're all volunteers. But what we do is Startup Weekend is an experiential learning experience. People get together on Friday night. They pitch ideas. They have 60 seconds to pitch an idea. The most popular ideas in the room form teams around them, right? And those teams have until Sunday afternoon, so from Friday night to Sunday afternoon, to develop a real working prototype, to talk to customers and get out of the building and validate and develop their business model, do all of that in order to pitch to a panel of judges who are involved in the startup community on Sunday evening, and the general public usually goes to those as well. If you launch a startup in 54 hours, right, from Friday at 6 to Sunday night. So you learn so much that way. It's not lectures. It's not a seminar. Nobody gives a talk. You go and you do, right? You get hands-on. You can just go and join a team. And one of the skill sets that's always short are the engineers, are the people who have even less experience than you guys. Like you might be like, you probably don't consider yourself a JavaScript wizard yet, right? But you know way more than anybody else there, or almost anybody else there, because like it's going to be 75, 80% business side, people with MBAs maybe, and they're looking for people like you. So you're going to learn a whole heck of a lot about what it takes to be a startup, what it's like working in a startup, and you're going to develop something very, very real, and maybe something real will develop out of it. But it's one of those things where the relationships you develop are invaluable. I know a guy who's a career developer. He was an engineer at a successful startup, but he was just an engineer. He wasn't a co-founder or anything. He just worked there. And by going to a startup weekend, he met some other people there, and they formed a company out of it. It wasn't the idea from Startup Weekend. He just met those people there, and now he's CTO of a funded startup, right? So that's how this stuff happens, about relationships, about learning how to do it. So I really can't emphasize enough. There's hundreds of them all over the world. So I can virtually guarantee there's one within driving distance of all of you at some point this year. Most of them are in the fall, October, November, but they occur all year round, all over the world. So startupweekend.org, do that, look it up. You won't regret it. It's great. Everybody should do it once, and maybe you'll become a junkie like me and just do dozens of them. So there's that. Okay. Any other questions? Okay. Wow. All right. Well, fantastic. So here's how this works. We are done for this, right? This is our last one. We won't be getting together on Thursday, but the videos will stay online indefinitely. So you can always go back if you just terribly miss me and need to hear my obnoxious voice. You can go back and watch the old videos. The Slack channel remains open. You're welcome to hang out and talk JavaScript or send me DMs or whatever. I know a lot of people who have, so Slack remains open. So please stay on Slack if you want to, and you may want to turn off notifications because we'll keep using this for other classes, but that's up to you. And but do stay on and feel free to talk JavaScript with other people who are interested in the language. If you want to keep in touch with me outside of that, you can Google me, Google Josh David Miller, and I come up. Facebook, LinkedIn, Twitter, whatever. Connect with me. I'd love it if you did. And then let me know how you end up applying this. I hope it was useful, and I hope you guys go on to build something that's useful. And if you do, send me a message. Let me know that you did. Or if you just want to know, hey, what do you think about this random thing, this random framework? Do that too. I'm more than happy to answer, because either one of two things. Either I'm going to have an opinion, or I don't know, and I'm going to be curious to develop one. So that's all good stuff. So thank you. We're at the end of our 9th hour. Definitely keep in touch. I look forward to hearing from all of you guys. And with that having been said, thank you and good night. I guess I should have stopped screen sharing a while ago. I don't know why I wasn't, but so you just got to stare at that view code for the last 20 minutes. Enjoy. All right.
Appreciate it, man.
See you guys.
Bye.